I'm Jenny Miller of Let's Get Sewing. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Are you ready to conquer your sewing frustrations? Then you've come to the right place. Make sure to watch all the way to the end to learn all the steps to making a proper flat-felled seam. Then be sure to click subscribe so that you get all of my video tutorials and learn how to conquer your sewing projects. Let's get sewing. Hey Circle, welcome to my Tuesday tutorial. I have kind of a long tutorial today. Well, not long, but there's lots of steps to it, and so I hope that you will find something in here that is helpful that you can take away. Today we're going to talk about flat-felled seams or double fold seams. There are two different techniques to achieve the same purpose. But a flat-felled seam is exactly what it sounds like. It is a flat seam. And it's a strong seam, and so one of the places that you'll see it the most is in jeans. This is, as you can see, it's the back. So this is the crotch seam for the jeans, and you'll see that on the outside it lays flat and it's top stitched. And if you turn the jeans inside out, it's still a flat seam that's top stitched. And because the fabric is wrapped around itself, and because there's double top stitching here, you get an extra strong seam in the crotch of the pants. The same thing is used down the inseam of jeans. You'll see it here, the flat seam, and if you go down to the hem, you'll see that it's still a flat seam on the inside. And again, super strong seam. And so, I mean, when jeans were invented, they were made out of canvas, which is really heavy. They're still denim, which is a heavy fabric. And so just the single seam over time can wear out. And so those seams in the crotch and inseam, they use the flat-felled seam just for strength and durability. Another place that you see oh boy, it's going to be hard to say that over and over today. Flat-felled seams a lot are in high-end dress shirts. I raided my husband's closet today, can you tell? And I don't say high-end to brag about the price or anything on it, but like I said, a flat-felled seam is stronger, looks a little bit nicer, and so it's a higher quality garment. It also takes extra steps, so you're going to pay a little bit more for a garment that has flat-felled seams, but it can be worth it depending on your needs. But this is a collared dress shirt, and here around the arm side, if you can see, is a flat seam with top stitching. And if we turn the shirt inside out, we still have a flat seam with top stitching. The same with the underarm seam. All the way down is a flat seam here with top stitching. And if you were to wear this shirt inside out, almost nobody could tell, because again, inside we have a flat stitch with top stitching. Another use, and I'm hoping that this will be helpful for some people that I've recently been considering, is there are a lot of children and even adults who struggle with the textures and stiffness of clothing, and so seams can be very irritating to them on the inside of a garment. And so I'm thinking that this flat-felled seam will be able to help some of them have a flat seam that doesn't stick out, doesn't irritate. It is a little bit of a stiff seam, so with things like denim and thicker fabrics, it might be a little too stiff still. But on softer things like the shirts or some knit pants, some lightweight pajama pant type pants, you're going to get a nice look, a strong seam, good quality, and still not have the seam to contend with. So this is my first real live tutorial. I am going to try not to make anybody seasick here. So I'm just going to pivot the camera so that you can see what I'm working on as I go. So just be patient with me here. But here I have two pieces of, this is just quilter's cotton weight fabric. And the first thing I'm going to do is to sew them with the right sides together. You can see that I have the right side of the fabric on either side. So I'm going to pivot down here so you can see while I'm sewing. I'm not a big pinner if I don't have to use pins, but if you wanted to pin this at this point, you could put a few pins in the seam. And I'm sewing with a 3.5 stitch length straight stitch. So here, I'm going to pivot you down here so that you can see while I'm working. All right, so I am going to use my 5/8 seam allowance, the standard seam allowance, and go ahead and sew right along that seam allowance, just a straight stitch, tying off at each end. And again, tying off at this end. All right, clipping my threads. And you can see that what I have here is just a regular seam sewn inside out. Okay? At this point, I'm going to cut one of those seam allowances in half. And so you have to determine which way you want that seam to roll at this point. And typically you would have it roll towards the back of the garment. So this would be like the front of the shirt or the front of the jeans. You want it to roll towards the back. It's really, that's more of an aesthetic rule than anything else, but that's what I do. So I'm going to take my tailor point scissors, my little sharp detailed scissors, and I'm going to cut only one of the seam allowances. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing here. Cut it in half. You know what, I'm going to turn you again. Sorry. Let's see if you can see better down here. I'm going to cut just this top one in half, right down the center. You could also use applique scissors for this. You could use regular scissors for it. I like these because they cut so easily and because they can be used on smaller seams and tinier places. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. I have cut one of my seam allowances in half so that I have a wider one here and a narrower one on top. At this point, I like to press my seam. So I'm going to turn you again over to here. And I'm going to press this wider seam over on top of the narrower seam with just a little bit of steam. And so there, you can see this is the wider seam and the narrower seam is underneath. Okay? At this point, we come back to the sewing machine. There we are. And again, you can pin if you want to. On a straight seam, actually on any seam like this, I don't tend to, but you're going to take this wider seam allowance and fold it. I'm going to hold it up here so you can see. I've got the wider seam allowance, the narrower one underneath. I'm going to fold it over that narrow seam allowance and fold it flat. Okay, so I've wrapped it around that narrow seam allowance, and now I'm going to top stitch along this folded edge. And you can put some pins in it. It's a very narrow, and so if you're pinning something narrow like that, I like to put them at an angle. Put my pin at an angle like that so that I can come in and out on the same seam allowance without creating too much bulk. But I'm not going to pin the whole thing. We'll just get started. I'm going to lower my presser foot, and then I have a guide on my presser foot that I'm going to follow, but the needle is too far over. So if you have a positional needle, I would move it over just a little bit so that we top stitch right along that folded edge. And so again, with my 3.5 stitch length, whoops, my machine doesn't want to feed it. I've got to start just a little bit farther. There we go. With my 3.5 stitch length, we're going to reverse, and then come forward. I'm having trouble because my dual feed isn't picking it up. There we go. That should do it. Nope. One more try. There we go. Well, I don't know why we're having issues with that. I'm going to start a little bit farther in. There we go. Okay. Now it's feeding. You'll do a little back stitch. We're just going to start from here and come forward. Pull out your pins as you go, and if you haven't pinned it, then as you go you're going to roll the wide seam allowance around the shorter seam allowance and continue to top stitch right along that edge. Reverse when you get to the other end, and that is your flat felled seam. Hopefully you can see. I tried to use black thread on there so that it would show. And when you look on the other side, now you only see one row of the stitching on this side, the other is hidden in that seam allowance. When they do the garments mass produced, like the ones that I showed you, they use a special machine with a double needle that goes down and gives you that double top stitching. Or they use a process called the double fold, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. But that is a straight flat felled seam. Next I want to show you how to do the same thing on a crotch if you were using it in the crotch of the pants. And so I've cut out a curved seam here as if this were the crotch of the pants. And again, I have right sides out, wrong sides together. I think I said right sides together before. You want your right sides facing out. You're going to sew it wrong sides together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Just like we did for the straight stitch, except that it's a curved seam. Okay, clip your threads, and so we have a regular seam, 5/8 inch seam with the wrong sides of the fabric together, the right sides are out. Again, we're going to cut one of the seam allowances. Let's see if we can see that. Using my tailor point scissors, I'm going to cut that in half. Okay, so I've cut this seam allowance, hopefully you can see this seam allowance right here, half the width of the other seam allowance. Now, because curved seams don't like to lay completely smooth sometimes, I go back in here and just make a few snips at the sharpest point in the curve here, cutting it not all the way to the seam, but almost to the seam. I'm maybe a millimeter away or so. This is the narrower seam that I'm snipping. Now, if we were to do that on the wider seam, when we turn it, we would have slits in our seam. We don't want that. So I just come out here at the very edge and make some almost microscopic clips. I hope you can see what we're doing here. Out here at the edge. But they can't even go halfway through. They're just teeny little snips out here at the edge. Okay, now we're going to press this, and I'll show you how I press it. Here, this is where I like to use a sleeve board. Okay, I'm going to open up my fabric flat, and I'm going to start at the top, which would be the flat part of this particular seam. So I'm going to start pressing up here, and I'm just going to use the tip of my iron, and you'll see why in just a minute. Because as I get into this curve, I need to be able to keep my fabric flat as I go. And so this is where the sleeve board comes in handy, because that fabric, the extra fabric, can fall out of the way, and I can just press the part that I need to. So I've pressed that wide part over top of the narrow seam underneath. Okay, and now we're going to do the same thing as before. Come back over here to the machine. We're going to wrap this wider seam around the narrower one and lay it flat, and we're going to top stitch along that folded edge. And I'm going to start a little bit further down this time so that my feed, I have the dual feed, and what happens sometimes if you're not careful is with a thicker seam like this, it hits against the dual feed rather than going under it. So if I start back here, my dual feed should pick that up. There we go. And then again, as we go, and I always use my needle down function so that every time I stop, my needle's in the fabric, and that way as I'm pushing and pulling here, I'm not twisting the fabric underneath the presser foot. So I'm going to continue to stitch right along that folded edge, just like the straight stitch. And then as we start to get into the curved part, same thing, but as you lay it down, make sure that you're pulling your fabric out on either side of that roll so that you don't get fabric tucked up inside your seam. Just keep going. Now at this point is where I have clipped the seam underneath. So just make sure that you get everything tucked nicely around those individual sections. Continue to pull your fabric out to the sides this way to keep everything flat and out of your way. until you reach the end of the seam. Reverse to tie off and pull it out. And there you have a flat felled crotch seam. Now it's curving this way, but all it's going to do when you sew it into the pants, then it would go this way. And can you see how this would be the crotch seam and these out here would be the leg of the pants? Okay, and inside we have a flat seam as well. Okay, the final one that I want to show you involves one extra step of stitching, which actually will make your seam stronger. And this way you will have the 2 rows of top stitching without having to have the double needle that they use commercially. So you'll see here I have my 2 pieces of fabric, and down this side I have put a line, a black line. That line is 3/8 of an inch wide, so determine how wide you want your seam to be, and that's how wide you'll make it. So our finished seam will be 3/8 of an inch. I've done the same on this fabric. There's a line down this side. I did it on the wrong side of the fabric so that you could see it better. It really won't make a difference which side we do it on. Okay? What that line is for is to match up your fabric flat. So we're going to sew the fabric, sew the seam flat like this. And I've aligned this edge with this line, and back here this edge will automatically line up with that line if they are the same. Okay? Again, you can pin if you want to. Put your pins on a diagonal like that, so that you can get them in and out without making a big bump in your fabric. But lining up along this line here, we're going to sew down the center between the 2 lines. We're going to come right down the middle there. Okay. Matching up, keeping it exactly along that edge, and we're coming right down the middle. All right, can you see here? There's the line I drew. Let me use my scissors. So here's the first line I drew. Here's the second line I drew. I've matched those edges, and then my stitching goes down the center between those 2 lines. So now at this point, we are going to wrap it. Let's see, we want to go this way, sorry. Wrap it so that both of those seams are inside, and we have made the letter S. And I don't know if you can tell, but this fabric comes over, it goes back and forth to make a letter S. There, let's see if we can. So we have our S shaped here. I took the flat seam, rolled them to the inside, and made a letter S. Okay, now we can top stitch, and I'm going to turn to the right side of the fabric to top stitch. Okay. Sorry, got to get everything adjusted just right. Okay, and as you go down, just continue to fold that into place. And you can feel the edges underneath, the edges of those seams. You could also pin this the whole way down if you wanted. So now we have one row of top stitching down this side. If we look on the back side, we still have the seam loose. So we need to tie that down. You could, if you want to use this edge as a guide, you could top stitch from this side, which is the back side, or you can go to the front side, and if you know how wide your seam is, stitch just slightly less than that, knowing that you're catching the seam on the back side, which is what I like to do, because then you're more likely to get your two seams parallel and they look better on the right side. And there you can see we have 2 rows of top stitching along the seam on this side. This is the right side, and on the wrong side we have 2 rows of top stitching. I probably could have top stitched even farther away, but there you're going to have a nice strong seam. All right, oh, take these glasses off. There we go. So I hope that this was helpful for you. As I was sewing, I thought of a couple other things. If you wanted to make a canvas bag, this kind of seam would be perfect to give you a nice strong bag, tote bag or book bag, whatever you were making. So hope that it made a lot of sense. If you could just comment below if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you. And of course, I love feedback on everything I do so that I can make it better and it will help you. So hope you're having a good afternoon. Let's see, Tammy, I think had a question. Can you iron? Yes, it says, can you iron that fold over first? I assume you're talking about the double fold that we just did. You could iron that first. I didn't. I would iron it twice if I did. I would fold it over the first seam allowance, iron it, then turn it over and turn the other side to fold it. But yeah, definitely you could iron it first, and you could pin it. Like I said at the beginning, I'm really bad when it comes to pinning. To me, it just takes more time if I can hold it in my fingers. If I'm working with fabrics that are really slippery, that kind of thing, then I do use pins a lot more. The first one that we did, yes, you could iron that fold. Okay, I see what you're saying. I pressed it flat and then I turned as I went. Yes, you could also turn it under and iron it. That would be a little bit tricky on the curved crotch seam, but again, if you used your sleeve board and just the tip of your iron, or if you have a tiny little craft iron that can get into those little points, yes, you could probably iron that over first and pin it too if you needed to. One other thing that I thought of too, if you were working on knits, this isn't the most ideal for knits, but you can make it work. I would, and let me show you here. So your presser foot, mine is hidden inside, but on some that you have a little knob up here to adjust the pressure of your presser foot. Consult your manual. I would release a little bit of that tension on the presser foot, because with the thicker seam, it's going to want to push it, if that makes sense. So I would just release that tension on your presser foot just a little bit, so it's not holding down quite so much. Use lots of pins with knits to really hold it in place. Use your fingers and go slowly. So I hope that that is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day. Bye.